neutral about the subject. Neither can a Chinese be neutral about the subject. And for that matter, I think even a third party, even an American or a European or an Australian or an Indian cannot be neutral about any political issue in this world today, because we're all connected. Like, everything is connected. We live in an interdependent world. You know, what happens in India makes a difference over here. So neutrality is dead. But you can still be objective. You know, you can still look at numbers and quantify information. You can look at facts. But the Chinese government argues that Tibet has always been part of China. And that's an argument that's either, like, you don't need to respond to that, because nothing has ever always been part of something, or, you know, like, everything has been changing in this world since the beginning of history. There's no such thing as always been part of China, you know. But when they say Tibet has always been part of China, one thing they're referring to is, sometimes they'll say, since the 12th century, Tibet has been part of China. And they'll say, you know, Tibet and China, they were both part of the Yuan dynasty since 12th century. So it can confuse people, but when the Chinese say Yuan dynasty, what they are actually referring to is the Mongol dynasty, the Mongol Empire. Because Mongolia, the largest empire ever in the history of the earth, they ruled pretty much half the world. They ruled parts of Europe, they ruled all of Asia. You know, they went really far. So of course, you know, China, Tibet, you know, India, these are all, you know, a lot of these countries came under parts of different empires at different times. So the Chinese government argues, you know, because Tibet and China were both part of the Yuan or the Mongol Empire, we are all part of the same empire, and now Tibet should be part of China. But the problem with that argument is, if that was the case, then Burma should be part of China. China should be part of Japan, actually. You know what I'm saying, right? Because then, like, you know, Vietnam should still be part of China. Vietnam should not be an independent country. China should actually be part of Russia. China should be ruled by Russia. So yeah, that's the problem with this argument. You know, just because you've been part of one empire doesn't mean, you know, you become part of that country. But even then, the Mongol Empire is not a Chinese dynasty. It's a completely different dynasty. Mongolia is a separate country. It's a separate nation. Genghis Khan was not Chinese. The other argument the Chinese government would often use is China has liberated Tibet in 1949. Because up until then, Tibet was a theocratic state, meaning ruled by a religious leader, ruled by a religious administration. And that is true. Until 1949, Tibet was a theocratic state. It was a religious state, right? Much like most of the European countries before the 18th century. Much like most of the countries in this world up until a moment, you know, a certain time. But they say Tibet was also a feudal state, meaning that there were lots of serfs in Tibet. Many Tibetans, you know, you became, when you work for a family, or you could borrow money from the monastery, and if you don't pay your monastery, if you don't pay your debt to the monasteries could establish that you belong to the monastery. And until you repay that money, your kids will also have to serve the monastery, have to, you know, work for the monastery, work in the farm, and give a certain portion of your income to the monastery every year. It's a terrible system. And this system existed in Tibet, it is true. And it also existed in China. It also existed in France, many countries in Europe also. And the only disconnect, or the only deviation from the truth, is China argues that 90% of Tibetans were serfs. They belonged to, they were slaves, and only 10% of the Tibetans were free. And that is not true. Majority of the Tibetans always lived as free, independent human beings, and almost 80% of the Tibetans were actually nomads. So the nomads, you can't get more free than a nomad. A nomad is like a cowboy, right? So nomads have always been independent. They're the self-made man. When slavery was a big issue in Africa, Europe, America, for many years when it was an issue, huge problem. In Tibet, majority of the Tibetan people were nomads, free. So this argument that China makes that 90% of the Tibetans were serfs, that's completely untrue. That is not to apologize or excuse the behavior of the Tibetan government, the Tibetan administration, and the Tibetan monasteries that did do a lot of horrible things, many horrible things. Back in the day, 15th century, 16th century, because with theocracy, the monasteries became really powerful, and in order to hold on to their power, they tried to keep Tibet isolated from the rest of the world. And this is what happens in a lot of countries, isolation, when certain institutions try to hold on to their power. And the monasteries considered any outside influence as a threat. So isolation was in their interest. And that was part of the reason why Tibet remained so isolated for so many years. And in the end, we paid such a heavy price for remaining isolated.
So can you